The arena lies silent. The sand is dry, the blood turned black. A lone gladiator stands beneath flickering torches, alive, crowned, adored. But Rome's real spectacle began after the cheers died. Down below, where stone corridors swallowed light, victory had a second meaning. The crowd saw strength. The empire saw control. And what waited in the dark was neither mercy nor reward. It was ritual. The kind of ritual history refuses to name. Tonight, we descend into that silence, to uncover what Rome made its victors do to the defeated, and why power always demanded a body to kneel. The air itself trembled. 80,000 Romans roared as one, their voices echoing against marble, bronze, and blood. In the arena, death was not an end. It was theatre. Every movement, every scream, every drop of blood was a note in the Empire's favourite song. For the gladiator, survival was the highest form of art. His heart pounded like the drums of war, his sword flashed under the pitiless sun, and when his opponent fell, he was no longer a man. He was a god, sculpted by violence and crowned with screams. To the people of Rome, he embodied vir, manhood, strength, discipline, the ideal Roman spirit. But beneath that illusion of divinity was a machinery of ownership. The gladiator did not belong to himself. He belonged to the lanista, the trainer, the dealer, the merchant of human flesh. His victories fattened someone else's purse. His pain was someone else's profit, and yet Rome was clever. It knew that control worked best when disguised as glory. So, after the blood and the roar, came the illusion. Wine poured, gold coins fell. The victor was escorted like a hero, bathed, perfumed, celebrated, and led downward into the bowels of the amphitheatre. There, in the corridors reeking of sweat and iron, Rome whispered its truest lesson. Power is not freedom. It is permission. They called it the victor's night, the moment when the slave became the god, when the killer could finally take what he wanted. The empire didn't care what that meant, only that he believed it meant something. To keep the fire alive, to keep the beast sharp, they gave him not peace, not rest, but a taste of domination. For a few hours the shackles disappeared. He was master of the broken, ruler of the ruined. And Rome, the eternal city, looked away, pretending not to see. The senators and the crowd needed their monsters. They needed men who could do what others could not, so that they themselves could remain civilized. That was the brilliance of the Roman system. It allowed savagery, then hid it beneath marble and myth. The arena was not about honor. It was about hierarchy. Each drop of blood reminded Rome that even pain could serve order. When the crowd left the Colosseum, they carried home the smell of slaughter and the illusion of justice. He was brave, they said. He deserved victory. But victory was only another cage, gilded, perfumed, deadly in its silence. The gladiator had killed for his life, and now he would live for his killing. That night, as torches flickered and chains clinked in the dark below, the mask of the victor finally slipped. What remained was not a god, but a man still owned, still used, still waiting for dawn. Rome was a master of spectacle, but not all its spectacles were public. Some were whispered, traded in shadows, passed between soldiers, nobles and Lannister like rumours of a god too shameful to worship openly. They called it Premium Noctis, the prize of the night. It was not a law, not written in marble or decree. It was an open secret, tolerated, encouraged, buried beneath the noise of glory. After the games, the victor descended into the underground chambers, where slaves, prisoners and captives waited, nameless, exhausted, bleeding. The prize was not gold, it was flesh. But this was not pleasure, it was domination. The gladiator, a slave himself, was permitted for one night to become the master. Rome understood psychology better than compassion. It knew that to keep its killers obedient, it had to let them taste power. Just enough to believe they had some, the act was ritualized. Torches, guards, a silent exchange, a ceremony of cruelty. Rome told its champions, "You have earned the right to take." And the empire fed that hunger like a farmer feeding his beasts, keeping them loyal through corruption. It blurred every line, master and slave, victim and victor, man and monster. The same system that demanded discipline by day demanded savagery by night. The Premium Noctis was not about desire. It was about reinforcing Rome's most sacred truth. Power exists to be used. The scholars of later centuries would erase this. Chroniclers of the empire preferred marble to mud. They wrote of valour, not vengeance, of heroes, not hunger. But the whispers persisted. Inscriptions half erased, letters hinting at the reward of the victorious. Even the poets, in veiled lines, spoke of the fire that burned beneath the games. In truth, the empire did not need to command cruelty. It designed a world where cruelty was self-sustaining. Every man who tasted power, even for one night, became complicit in the system that enslaved him. The gladiator who dominated another carried that darkness into the next fight. Fiercer, harder, angrier. Rome didn't just build roads and aqueducts. It built obedience. And obedience, once rooted in the body, never died. When the torches went out, when the victor walked away, silence returned to those underground chambers. The broken were left behind, unseen, unrecorded, erased. The next day, the arena would open again, and the cycle would repeat. The spectators believed they had watched courage. In truth, they had witnessed a breeding ground for submission. That was Rome's secret genius, its ability to turn victory itself into a mechanism of control. The Premium Noctis was never about lust. It was about the economy of fear. It reminded everyone, even the victors, that their power was conditional, their pleasure borrowed, their freedom always ending at dawn. And so, the gladiator's greatest defeat did not come from a blade, but from the illusion that his victory meant he was free. Rome's cruelty was not chaos, it was structure. Every scream, every cheer, every drop of blood was part of a design older than most of the men who spilled it. The gladiatorial system was not built to entertain, it was built to control. The lanista stood at its centre, part coach, part merchant, part god. His arena was not the Colosseum, but the barracks. There, behind iron doors, men were reshaped, beaten, fed, trained, conditioned. They learned not only how to fight, but how to obey. Their muscles became contracts, their scars, currency. The lanista was not merely an owner. He was the priest of Rome's true religion, dominance. He knew that obedience required more than chains. It required belief. So he gave his fighters fragments of power. A night of wine, a woman, a public name shouted by the mob. These were not rewards. They were tools, illusions engineered to keep rebellion dormant. Rome understood that freedom is dangerous, but illusion is efficient. A slave who believes he's a god will never think to break his cage. The system was perfect in its balance of cruelty and reward. Gladiators who fought well were showered with praise and small privileges. Better food, fewer beatings, the right to speak first, to wear their hair longer. The illusion grew layer by layer, until some even began to believe the empire loved them. But everything was still owned. Their sweat, their victories, even their dreams. The moment a fighter showed too much pride, too much independence, he was reminded, through pain, through loss, through the night prize, that Rome decides who you are and what you deserve. Rome had no need for mercy. It had math. For every man broken, 2 more would rise. For every defiant spirit, 10 would learn from his punishment. The system recycled fear like water in a fountain, endlessly flowing, endlessly clean on the surface, endlessly polluted beneath. And it worked because everyone, from the senator to the slave, was caught inside it. The senator paid to watch the killing. The crowd cheered to forget their hunger. The gladiator fought to forget his chains. Each believed they were free because someone else was beneath them. That was Rome's masterpiece, not empire, not law, but hierarchy. The invisible ladder where every rung bled into the next. In that world, humanity became a form of debt, and the debt could only be paid with obedience or with flesh. History remembers the victors. Rome built statues for its heroes, coins for its emperors, scrolls for its generals. But no marble bears the names of the broken, those who never entered the arena by choice, those who became props in Rome's performance of power. The night prize had its victims, and they were not nameless, though Rome made them so. Captured foreigners, rebels from conquered lands, slaves of slaves. But there were others too. women punished for defiance, debtors sold into servitude, even Roman citizens stripped of their status for offending the wrong man. To the empire, their value was symbolic. They existed to remind others of what happened when you lost. Theirs was a punishment beyond pain, to become proof of another man's dominance. In those silent chambers below the arena, humanity was turned into theatre. There were no witnesses, no historians, only walls that smelled of blood and oil. The victors entered not as men, but as extensions of the state's power. The defeated were not human enough to refuse. And yet, their silence speaks louder than any senator's speech. Because Rome erased them so thoroughly, their absence became a monument of its own. The cruelty was not random. It was calculated. Rome's system needed victims to feed its illusion of the order, to remind the masses that power must always be visible, that someone must kneel for others to feel tall. The lanista called them spoils. The guards called them property. But the truth was simpler. They were witnesses to how power consumes itself. Those who survived the night did not live. They lingered. Some were sold again as servants, entertainers, or worse, offerings for the next game. Some disappeared into the empire's labyrinth of prisons and brothels, and some, those who could no longer be used, were discarded quietly, their bodies burned with the animal carcasses from the arena. Rome claimed to honour its dead with rituals, but not these. Their ashes were swept into the Tiber without name, without coin, without mourning. They were erased because their existence contradicted Rome's image of virtue, and yet every empire leaves ghosts. Sometimes in the writings of a poet or a faded inscription on a soldier's wall, we glimpse a whisper, a name, a plea, a prayer half scratched away. One fragment found near Pompeii reads, "I was seen, I was taken. May the gods see what men will not. That is all we have left of them." The forgotten victims of Rome remind us that cruelty does not need hatred to survive, only order and silence. And when a civilization begins to turn suffering into spectacle, it does not collapse from invasion. It rots from the inside until even its gods grow ashamed to look down. In Rome, survival did not mean salvation. Those who lived through the night, the broken ones, became part of something worse, the system's renewal. Rome's economy ran not just on coin and conquest, but on flesh. Children born from violence were labelled servi arenae, property of the arena. Their first cradle was a cage, their first lullaby was the sound of iron striking iron. The empire had found a way to turn even the byproduct of cruelty into profit. The Lanisti kept careful records, not of names, but of weights, diets, and potential. Infants were raised under the same roof as the men who had broken their mothers. Some would grow to fight, others would serve in silence, feeding lions, cleaning blood, holding torches. Rome called this efficiency. History calls it damnation. No soul was beyond commodification. Every breath was calculated, every body accounted for. A child could be sold before they spoke their first word. If strong, they were promised to the arena. If weak, they were sent to brothels or temples where the gods themselves seemed to turn away. This was the genius of Rome's cruelty. It needed no one's approval, because it wore the mask of civilization. Officials spoke of management of resources. Priests spoke of divine order. Philosophers debated the nature of virtue, while children of the arena learned to eat without hope. By turning life into inventory, Rome removed guilt from the equation. There was no crime in owning what the gods had supposedly granted you, no sin in using what the system called disposable. In time, even the gladiators believed it. The older ones trained the young, teaching them to fight to survive, to kill. A perverse lineage, where pain was inheritance and obedience was legacy. The arena became a self-sustaining ecosystem of despair. Its walls did not just contain bodies, they contained generations. Blood begot blood, and Rome profited from both. A philosopher once wrote, "The empire endures because it wastes nothing." He meant it as praise, but beneath those words lies the most horrifying truth of all. Rome had learned to recycle humanity, and so the cycle continued. The broken became breeders, the offspring became slaves, the slaves became fighters, the fighters became killers, the killers became broken again. Rome called it destiny, but destiny, in Latin, only meant what has been decided. Above ground, while the blood dried below, Rome's marble villas pulsed with whispers. Senators' wives draped in silk spoke the names of gladiators like forbidden prayers. They wore bracelets carved with the symbols of the arena: lion, sword, laurel. They bought oils made from the sweat of champions, bottled and sold as aphrodisiacs. The same city that condemned lust as sin made it a business. Rome's moral code was a masterpiece of hypocrisy. It punished the act in daylight, but worshipped it by candlelight. To desire a gladiator was to flirt with danger. These men were slaves, yet the empire's most irresistible creation. They carried death in their eyes, and the illusion of freedom in their stride. For the noblewomen of Rome, to touch such a man was to touch the edge of the forbidden, the pulse of everything the city repressed. Stories spread of senators' wives sneaking into training barracks, of secret affairs paid for in jewels, of powerful women disguising themselves to watch their favourites fight. The poets called it amor ferox, savage love. The philosophers called it moral decay. But both missed the point. It wasn't about desire. It was about proximity to power. Even Rome's aristocrats, insulated by wealth, surrounded by slaves, still felt powerless before the machinery of empire. The closer they could get to raw strength, the more alive they felt. The gladiator became an object of contradiction, a slave who symbolized freedom, a killer who embodied beauty. And in that paradox, Rome found its reflection. The empire's sickness was not that it was cruel, but that it was fascinated by cruelty. It dressed savagery in gold and called it art. It made lust into ritual and called it tradition. A senator could sponsor 100 executions in the morning and still dine that night beneath frescoes of Venus. He would toast the Republic while his wife toasted her champion. They believed themselves civilized because they had vocabulary for their sins. In the markets, merchants sold charms for strength, said to contain drops of gladiator blood, perfumes for courage, mixed with ash from the arena sands. Even children played games pretending to be heroes, shouting "Hail Caesar!" while mimicking the motions of killing. Rome's hypocrisy was total and invisible to those who lived within it. It didn't hide its decay, it decorated it. The city glowed by torchlight, its fountains spilling water dyed red for festivals. Statues of Mars and Venus stood side by side, war and pleasure sharing the same pedestal. This was not a civilization losing its morals, it was a civilization turning them into entertainment. And beneath the marble and the music, a question began to fester. When a society turns its sins into spectacles, does it still know what is sacred? Or has it simply learned to worship itself? At first, the system worked perfectly. The victor descended into darkness. The defeated were offered up like sacrifices. Every night followed the same script: domination, silence, and the illusion of control. But Rome had not accounted for repetition, and repetition has a way of breeding something the empire feared more than rebellion: recognition. There were moments, rare, fragile, dangerous, when the same victor faced the same captive again and again. At first, it was routine. Then it became memory. The human mind, even when trained to obey, remembers patterns: a face, a sound, the trembling of hands in torchlight, and from memory empathy can bloom, quiet, defiant, unwanted. For the gladiator, this was corruption of the soul. He had been taught to see the broken as objects, reflections of his power, but now he saw the eyes. The same eyes that looked back night after night, not pleading, not accusing, only witnessing. In that gaze, he saw himself, a slave wrapped in borrowed strength. The lanista warned them against this. Pity, he said, is poison. But pity is the one emotion the empire could never fully erase. It crawled through the cracks of cruelty, like weeds between stones. Some began to hesitate, a swing delayed by a heartbeat, a command disobeyed. It was subtle, invisible to the crowd above, but in the depths where silence carried weight, that hesitation was revolution. What happens when the beast looks back and sees the human it has become? Rome called it weakness, but it was something closer to awakening. The gladiator who once took pride in his dominance began to question it. Was his power real, or simply another chain gilded with illusion? If he could take another's freedom and still remain a slave, what had he truly won? The woman, or man, who once trembled now began to see the tremor in his hands. They were no longer predator and prey, but two souls caught in the same design, one forced to act, the other forced to endure. History does not record what they said, if they said anything at all. But silence can be eloquent. Perhaps in that silence the Empire's entire ideology cracked, just for a breath. Because the moment empathy enters cruelty, the machinery trembles. It cannot function when the killer starts to see the victim as human. In that recognition lay the most forbidden act of all, compassion. Not love, not rebellion, but understanding. And understanding is the seed of collapse. The next morning the games continued. The crowd cheered. The sun rose. But somewhere behind a gladiator's hardened face a question began to grow, one that would echo long after his name was forgotten. If power makes me this, then what is left of me? Rome always knew how to silence questions, with spectacle. When rumours spread of hesitation among the champions, the Lannister moved quickly. A single act of mercy could infect an entire barracks. So they staged a lesson, a new performance for the people, a purge dressed as entertainment. The chosen gladiator was one of Rome's favourites, undefeated, adored, sculpted into legend by blood. But something in him had changed. He fought slower, as if every strike weighed upon his soul. He was no longer fighting men, he was fighting what Rome had made of him. The Lannister noticed. So did the crowd. To restore order, they planned the perfect punishment. He would be forced to face the very captive he once spared. The amphitheatre filled early that day. Trumpets blared, vendors shouted, children waved banners bearing his name. No one knew that today's game was not about victory, but obedience. When the gates opened, two figures stepped into the light. The champion, once a god to the masses, now hollow-eyed, carrying the weight of conscience, and across from him, the familiar silhouette, smaller, trembling, but unbroken. The crowd cheered for blood. The Emperor raised his thumb, and in that moment, the gladiator understood. If he killed, he survived. If he refused, he died. Either way, Rome would win. He raised his weapon, then lowered it. The crowd gasped. The Lannister shouted. The air grew still, thick with disbelief. For the first time, the arena fell silent. The crowd, trained to love violence, did not know what to do with compassion. Then came the order. Archers, arrows. The sky darkened with feathers and steel. The gladiator turned, not toward his opponent but toward the stands, toward the master who had owned him, and with one motion, he hurled his blade, not in rage, but in truth. The weapon struck the Lannister's throne. A gasp rippled through the sea of marble faces. It was not rebellion that terrified Rome, it was meaning. For in that one act the slave had rewritten the script. The arrow struck him before he could breathe again. He fell without glory, without last words. But what he left behind was more dangerous than any sword, an idea that perhaps Rome's gods were not gods at all, that perhaps obedience was not destiny, that perhaps even a slave could die free. The crowd sat in silence, no applause, no cheers, only the sound of wind moving through blood-stained sand, a whisper that something sacred had broken. The next morning the arena was spotless. The blood had been washed away. The sand was raked smooth, as if the rebellion, the hesitation, the man himself had never existed. Rome was merciful only to its own memory. It rewrote everything. The Lannister was buried with honours. The gladiator's name was erased from the rolls, his likeness shattered, his story burned. To the public it was as if he had never lived. The games resumed before noon. New fighters entered, new victims waited, and the crowd cheered again, the sound returning as easily as breath. Because that was Rome's genius. Its system did not depend on men, it depended on obedience. No individual mattered, only the rhythm of control. The Empire could replace bodies, but never the machine. It had perfected something far more terrifying than cruelty: efficiency. The rebellion was not a threat, it was an adjustment, a reminder to the audience that mercy is chaos, and chaos must be erased. Rome did not need to silence compassion, it simply drowned it in applause. From above the emperor nodded. The crowd shouted the same words they always did. Ave imperator morituri te salutant. "Hail, Emperor! We who are about to die salute you." They did not realize they were all speaking the same vow, citizens and slaves alike. For the Empire, obedience was not forced, it was learned. Children were raised on the theatre of death. Merchants profited from the scent of the arena. Philosophers rationalized it as divine order. Even the poets, who should have mourned, instead wrote hymns to the spectacle. And so the system endured, not because it was invincible, but because everyone needed it to be. It gave meaning to their fear, structure to their chaos, purpose to their cruelty. It let Rome call its sickness civilization. When the emperor died, the next took his place. When one champion fell, another rose. The same torches burned, the same gates opened, the same cheers echoed. Time passed, but the machinery of domination never aged, and in that endless repetition, Rome achieved its truest victory. It made dehumanization ordinary. It taught the world that power must always consume something to feel real. Even now, centuries later, the Colosseum stands. Broken, yes, but not silent. Its stones still breathe with memory. The wind that moves through its arches carries the faint sound of chains, the echo of cheers, the ghosts of those who lived and died for the illusion of control. Tourists walk its corridors, photographing what they believe is history. But the true ruins are not made of stone. They live inside us. Every time we mistake dominance for strength, every time we glorify power over compassion, the machinery turns again. Because Rome never died. It adapted. It found new arenas, offices, battlefields, screens. It learned to disguise its cruelty with reason, to make obedience feel like choice. That is the curse of empire. It outlives its tyrants by living inside the hearts of its admirers. So the next time we call someone a conqueror, or cheer for another's fall, or mistake silence for peace, remember the gladiator who refused to kill, and the empire that killed him for remembering he was human. Rome's true legacy was not law or architecture or empire. It was the idea that control could be eternal, that a system could be stronger than the souls it crushed, and perhaps it was right, because 2,000 years later we still applaud.